The moment the Supreme Court's 7-2 emergency action hit the public docket, it felt like the political ground under America's feet cracked open. Not a tremor, not a ripple, a full-blown constitutional earthquake. Overnight, decades of legal assumptions evaporated. Entire state frameworks were thrown into jeopardy. Attorneys general began scrambling before dawn. Legislative leaders demanded emergency briefings, and legal analysts across the country admitted they had never seen anything quite like this. Washington, state capitals, advocacy groups, and legal institutions were all blindsided because what the Supreme Court just did wasn't routine. It wasn't procedural, and it definitely wasn't expected. This was a direct intervention, fast, forceful, and devastatingly clear, and it has already altered the trajectory of one of the most explosive legal battles in modern American history. In a 7-2 decision that stunned even seasoned court watchers, the justices signaled that a line has been crossed, one the court is no longer willing to ignore. What triggered this emergency action was not a simple dispute, but a deeper constitutional crisis brewing beneath the surface. For months, lower courts and state governments have pushed the boundaries of federal authority, creating legal inconsistencies that left millions of Americans unsure of their rights. That era ended today. The Supreme Court's majority didn't simply intervene. They struck with unmistakable intent, freezing decisions, demanding immediate review, and firing off a judicial shockwave that analysts say will reshape the balance of power between the states and the Constitution itself. What makes this moment so monumental is not just the outcome, but the message encoded within it. The court's 7-2 action shows unity and urgency. Two things the Supreme Court rarely demonstrates at the same time. The fact that 7 justices agreed the situation required emergency intervention means the majority believes something far more serious is unfolding than the public realizes. And the dissenting justices were forced to acknowledge that the implications reach far beyond the surface-level issue. The court didn't wait for oral arguments. It didn't request extended briefing. It didn't hesitate for months, as it often does with high-stakes cases. Instead, it stepped in with immediate authority, sending a national warning. The court sees a constitutional imbalance building, and it is preparing to correct it decisively. What triggered this response was a collision between deeply contested legal principles, federal authority, state regulatory power, constitutional rights, and judicial overreach. Several states had attempted to use recent lower court rulings as justification to expand regulatory frameworks in ways that contradicted established Supreme Court precedent. Critics argued that these states were deliberately testing the boundaries, using creative interpretations of federal statutes to enact policies far beyond what the Constitution permits. Supporters claimed the states were filling gaps left by Congress, but the Supreme Court's new action reveals that the majority sees something different altogether, a pattern of disregard for constitutional boundaries that threatens the stability of national law. Under normal circumstances, the court prefers to let issues develop slowly through the legal system. But this time, the justices didn't wait. They identified the danger early, intervened immediately, and applied a legal brake to stop states from acting beyond their authority. That alone is extraordinary, but combined with the 7-2 vote, it becomes unmistakable. The court is preparing to reshape how far states can go when it comes to laws that directly affect constitutional freedoms. The emergency action immediately froze a series of lower court decisions that had allowed states to test new regulatory frameworks. These rulings had created confusion among citizens, law enforcement agencies, and federal institutions. With the court's intervention, those experiments are now in limbo, and the nation is bracing for a full-scale judicial review that could rewrite decades of legal interpretation. States that had rushed to implement controversial measures suddenly find themselves exposed. Policies that seemed secure yesterday are legally vulnerable today, and millions of Americans who were affected by these regulations are now caught in a tense, uncertain moment, waiting for the final judgment that could change everything once again. What's particularly striking is the language used by the court. The majority opinion expressed deep concern about a rapid erosion of consistent constitutional application, a rare statement that signals the justices see a broader systemic issue. According to legal scholars, this phrase alone indicates the court is preparing to issue a landmark ruling in the near future, one that could restore clarity, impose limits on state experimentation, and reinforce constitutional protections nationwide. These scholars note that the court typically reserves such language for moments where the nation is headed toward legal fragmentation, with states interpreting federal precedents differently and creating national instability. Meanwhile, inside state governments, panic is already spreading. Governors have convened emergency meetings. Attorneys general are drafting immediate legal responses. Agencies that relied on lower court decisions to justify their new regulatory authority now find themselves without legal footing. Questions about compliance, enforcement, and liability are exploding across departments. And perhaps most importantly, political leaders who champion these regulatory frameworks are facing public backlash as citizens demand clarity, answers, and accountability. Advocacy groups on both sides of the political spectrum reacted instantly as well. Pro-rights organizations celebrated the emergency action as a long overdue correction, calling it proof that the Supreme Court is ready to enforce constitutional limits that states have been ignoring. Meanwhile, groups that supported the contested regulations accused the court of overreach, warning that the decision could dismantle public policy frameworks built over decades. The intensity of reactions underscores the high stakes of what comes next. This is no longer a routine legal dispute. It has become a defining moment in the struggle over the balance of state and federal power. Legal analysts warned that the implications may be even broader than the public realizes. The court's action doesn't simply affect one set of regulations. It sets a powerful precedent that will influence future cases involving federalism, administrative authority, and constitutional rights. If the court ultimately rules that states exceeded their power, it could trigger a massive rollback of regulatory structures across multiple policy areas. That includes systems related to licensing, enforcement, and oversight that rely on aggressive interpretations of state authority. And once the court establishes a new standard, lower courts will be forced to follow it, reshaping legal expectations nationwide. What comes next is potentially transformative. The Supreme Court has effectively announced that it intends to take control of this issue. The majority's decision to intervene at this stage signals that a full review is almost certain. If the court grants certiorari, the resulting case would become one of the most consequential constitutional battles of the decade. The justices would have the opportunity to clarify the limits of state regulatory authority, redefine how courts evaluate constitutional claims, and establish new protections for individuals whose rights are directly influenced by state actions. And make no mistake, the justices know how explosive this moment is. They understand the political tension surrounding the case. They know that any decision will spark intense national debate. But they also know that their role is to enforce the Constitution, not to appease political forces or public pressure. Their 7-2 emergency action shows that they are prepared to do exactly that. Across America, millions of citizens are watching this unfold with a mixture of hope and unease. For some, the court's intervention offers reassurance that constitutional safeguards still hold firm. For others, it represents a shift in judicial power that could undo policies they believe are necessary. But regardless of political perspective, one truth is now undeniable. The Supreme Court has re-entered the arena with force, and the shockwave of their emergency action is still spreading. As this legal battle intensifies, the country braces for the court's next move. The emergency action was only the opening strike. What comes next could redefine the constitutional landscape for a generation. The court may soon deliver a ruling that permanently reshapes the boundaries of state authority, strengthens federal constitutional supremacy, and establishes new protections for millions of Americans whose rights were placed in jeopardy. For now, the nation waits. The Supreme Court's 7-2 emergency decision has already changed everything, but the ultimate impact is still forming, because when the justices act with this level of urgency, one thing is certain: a seismic ruling is coming, and when it arrives, America will not look the